All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Skillist podcast, where I prove that Brad is wrong about many things. My name is Matt Corradino. I run Caribbean Earth Skills and teach for some other people, too. This is Brad Salon. Who are you, Brad?
I run Root School with my wife, Sarah Corrigan, in Vermont. And I am here to tell Matt he is full of shit.
Well, that could be possibly true, but I'm not buying it. So, yeah, we're starting this podcast to debate, joke around, talk some smack, and just generally shoot the shiza about primitive skills. So-called primitive skills? God, we need to have a whole episode on what else to call
primitive skills, what we've been calling it for 20 years, but have to find a different name for it because some people are offended by the name primitive.
Yeah, it's totally true. Some people are offended by the name primitive.
I'm not. I just always default to primitive skills, but
I default to primitive skills, but the way I see it is like, unless we're using our minds to do stuff with, it's still pretty primitive. That's just what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, it just describes it. It's skills that are from a more primitive time period than the technological age or the industrial age.
It's true.
I don't see it as
the root.
I don't see it as pejorative. I see it as descriptive. But yeah.
Anyway.
I'm
with you.
I'm
with you.
Yeah, ancestral skills,
Earth skills, survival skills. Yep, that's right. What were the two you went to? Ancestral and bushcraft.
Yeah.
I went to survival and something.
It's all, yeah.
Mine was better.
Sure.
So today we are going to banter on. Go ahead, laugh it up. Today we're going to banter on for a little bit about stone versus steel.
Yeah. So
I'm going to take the potentially losing end of this debate, but there's a couple winners about these here stone tools that I would like to talk about today.
Yeah.
You want to start us off? You want to kick us off, Mr. Steely?
Well, sure. I mean, as somebody who's been studying stone tools pretty aggressively for, 20-something years, 24 years or something, I clearly love stone tool making. I think that as far as, the argument about which has more efficacy in a survival situation, there's no... Other than if you have no steel tools because you're stupid and you didn't bring any, or you're in a situation in which you had no access to any. Even your fucking chickens are laughing at you. No, I just think
they're being scared here.
Yeah.
By my stone tools.
By your stone tools, of course. Yeah. So I think that there are a few places where in the modern age, even with access to steel tools, that I go towards stone purposefully, and I think it's good to know how to make them. But where I live, there's almost no access to decent material, and the difference in terms of how hard it is to be in a survival situation with versus without the good shit, the steel, it's no question that steel is better. I'd also like to cite the archaeological record or the anthropological record in which, whenever given a chance, every indigenous group I've ever heard of immediately moved to steel tools. And there's things like, needles and a steel pot and scissors that are pretty hard to replicate or to work around, So.
Well, I think it would be pretty hard to argue that steel doesn't make it easier. I think that's pretty freaking obvious that steel makes things easier in a lot of ways. However, there are a few caveats to that. I would say that a big part of the switch, and of course I can't know because I wasn't there, but I would say that a big part of the switch from stone to steel would have had to do with how much longer that tool lasts and how many times you can reuse that steel, because it's not brittle, doesn't break down very, very much smaller, and easier to recreate that that edge within certain parameters. I would also make the argument that you could have your steel tool, but if you don't have a decent sharpener, and if you don't have access to some stones that you could easily flatten to resharpen your steel tool, that I'm not going to say that you're still going to decrease your manufacture time on a lot of projects, even with a dull knife. But at least for finer work, if you have a dull knife and you don't have a means to sharpen it, it's arguable that you might not be in much better of a position if you had decent stone, that you had enough of it that you could easily make a quick sharp edge. Because the making of a sharp edge, once you know how to do it with stone, is far faster and arguably more consistent. Right, especially for a beginner. Once I learn how to make a flake, once I learn how to take a flake of stone off in a relatively efficient way, versus for some people it takes quite a long time to get any good at sharpening a knife, like with, unless you have a guide on your sharpener. I know for me it's taken me quite a while to be really consistent with sharpening my knife, and it's all about the tool that I use. For me, I'm going to make the argument here, which I'm sure you're going to fight back on this, that once you understand the basic principles, that the stone tools is kind of a more intuitive process versus the steel tools, which is more of a muscle memory, repetitive motion process. So for some people, that muscle memory, that repetitive motion process can take longer to master. I'm talking about master, not like understand, right? Versus if you have a basic understanding and the right stones, you're going to strike it and the stone is naturally going to break really sharp if you have a halfway decent material selection. My argument is to know both, right? That relying purely on steel can set you up for a lot more difficulty than knowing both and utilizing the stone tools when it makes the most sense.
We're not arguing for both. You have to pick a side, motherfucker.
I told you my side.
You have to pick a side. Listen, no, I mean, clearly...
If I have to pick a side, do I have to go to the big guns right in the beginning?
Clearly picking all options is the best. And I hear you about resharpening knives. I would say that, one, if you don't have like a sharpening tool as a part of your like baseline day kit, you're not very intelligent. Like diamond sharpeners are very easy to use and lightweight, and you get a fair amount of sharpenings out of them before they're no good. And then, beyond that, if you understand edge technology and you understand, I just need to somehow grind this metal edge so that it comes to two angles that are as clean and homogeneous as possible, and then I need to strop those edges on a piece of leather, that like field sharpening is totally reasonable, and people have been doing it since they figured out tools that were made of metal. So I don't know if it's really more intuitive or less intuitive than stone. It's just a different skill set to me. Like I watch people be really bad at flint knapping all the time. I teach them and I'm like, you're gonna destroy your fingers, and no, don't do it like that. I don't feel like it's incredibly intuitive, other than like ape throw rock at other rock. But I'd say, like, field sharpening aside, the durability you're going to get, especially if you protect that edge and you don't use it for things like cutting rope or cutting grass or like tons of batoning that you don't need to do, and that you have a good edge that's durable, that there's a lot to be desired about that. And then outside of the world of just edge tools, like steel allows you to have things like rasps, and those are pretty hard to replicate with stone. You can make tooth scrapers, and those kind of work like a rasp, but not nearly as efficiently. And then, again, back to things like a steel cook pot or a steel, this I would say is like...
Oh, man, we're getting into cooking pots now? Oh, this isn't fair.
Just this,
I wasn't prepared for cooking argument.
Show me your gourd that can do what this can do.
I will. If I had it sitting here, okay, I can't do quite what yours can do. It's pretty close. I can't get a rolling boil.
Right, can you just
gourd,
stick it in a
calabash,
fire?
I can... Yeah, definitely. Have you ever boiled in a paper cup before?
Yeah, I have. It makes it incredibly brittle. You get to do it like once. It's a fucking party trick. Fuck you.
Well, with the calabash, I can't get a rolling boil, but I can get it up to like where it's starting a simmering boil, where it's got a few little bubbles, and that's over the coals, and I get many, many uses out of that. I don't know how many. Like, I had one for, well, it made it through 6 survival trips, and that was, however many boilings, 2 per day, X number of days. Let's say 50 times we cooked through it before it was no good. And then heating up stones and throwing it in there, that works great, right? You get a boil going pretty quick with that, especially if you have the right stones. I would say actually with a decent grinding stone, right? A decently flat, relatively flat grinding surface, sand and water, it goes maybe just a little bit slower than a rasp. Plus, who the hell's going to carry a rasp?
Oh, fuck you, man. Next time we make bows.
Who's carrying a rasp?
The next time we make bows, you get to use sand and water, and I'll use a Nicholson 49. And we can see
How
if it
dull
takes
is your
just
Nicholson
a little
49?
It's brand new, bro. I teach classes where I end up taking passes off of fricking everybody's bows. There's no way I'm not
but we're
buying
talking about a
rasp
survival.
for me.
We're talking about a survival situation, right? A survival situation. Are you really going to carry that Nicholson 49 with you? Is that really in your day pack? You
Not
have
in a
Nicholson
survival
49
situation.
in your day pack right now?
If it were like an apocalypse go bag, I would absolutely have a rasp.
Well, of course, if it's an apocalypse, I'm driving my freaking car. Are you kidding me?
Okay.
I'm driving my car, I'm bringing everything I can, but I'm talking about, you don't carry that rasp around with you.
Of course not. Well, I mean,
you can
unless
carry
I'm
your
working on a
knife.
bow.
That's what you carry.
Yes, of course.
Right?
So here's what I will say. though.
I've made a bow with a knife, right? I'm not saying that doesn't work. What I'm saying is there's a reasonable replacement for it, and it's a lot more reasonable to know how to do that and to have some experience with that primitive tool that you can make in the woods versus carrying a rasp, which you don't do.
You're sure. The best I mean, we're still talking about steel knives being better. We're just talking about rasps being possibly easier to replicate. The best arguments for stone you haven't even made yet.
Well, there's one argument that is way better for stone that trumps all of your other arguments.
Is it that?
Which is that
you can find stones in the woods?
Well, that's my second best argument.
So what's your best argument?
My second best argument is that you can find stones anywhere, and if you know what to do with those stones, you can make a tool out of any stone.
Right.
You're not going to make a refined arrowhead out of rugged stone that you have in Vermont. However, like the flake, right? That's an ancient tool, and I gave up steel for a while so that I could better learn how to use these. It wasn't a full year, but it was pretty close to a year. Now, I will admit, it was very relieving to go back to using a knife after that year. Is that the end of the argument? However, what I learned was that you might not make, 99% of the time you're using this. A different size, right? Like this is my carving flake, right? I'm not going to be carving with this little tiny thing, but with this, this is a reasonable draw knife, right? I can grip it on each side. It's got a pretty sharp edge. I can carve with it. I'm not going to carve on the furniture here because that would be a bad move. That'd be the easiest thing to demonstrate. Those more rugged stones, sure, you're not going to use them for like a refined, one of these, but you're easily could make flakes that are going to be field expedient, right? So yes, stones are everywhere. Once you know how to read that stone and say, okay, this is good for this type of tool, this is good for that type of tool, right? Once you understand that, yeah, you can find stones anywhere. So that's a huge plus right there, right? You can find stones anywhere. The other huge, I just got to pull out my big guns right now. Stones are much cooler, right? This makes me so much cooler.
What are you talking about?
How cool I am. You ain't gonna hold up your knife. Oh, I got a knife. Oh, there's a million of them out there. That shit looks so cool.
I don't know, man. The bushcraft world is freaking out right now because their whole fucking game is axes and knives.
The bushcraft world.
They're all like, but what about my 17th knife review? No, I mean that's why
the video gamers, the gamers,
yeah,
of survival skills. I'm sorry, they're all ready to kill me right now.
No, I agree with you. Stone is where stone wins. I mean, aside from the fact that like if I have an animal to skin and I can just pop some razor sharp flakes that are disposable, then that's pretty awesome. And then honestly, for dry scraping hides, especially pelts, I prefer stone tools, especially like English flint, like a little micro napped English flint thumb scraper. It's pretty hard to beat.
I mean, we only use these flakes for butchering animals that are here at camp. Obviously, if I'm out in the woods and I don't have like 30 of these, I carry the knife with me for hunting because cutting the throat of an animal to kill it quicker, as I just want to have that option. And, just holding it, I had to carry a pretty big knife, like a pretty big piece of stone, to have a long enough blade to cut an animal's throat. And I'd rather not carry that, that huge stone because it's going to weigh more. But, yeah, I mean, as far as if they're at the house, a flake like this, so much faster for making those cuts. Yeah. And goodness gracious, for scraping, this is way better for scraping.
And yes, this
especially
is much
since you don't
cooler
have to resharpen
than a steel broadhead. Like, there's no question about it. And I made it with my own two hands, and it's a pretty rock, and all those things. And they've been killing things for on arrows for 35,000 years, and on atlatls for 50, 60, maybe 75,000 years. So
nobody even knows how long they've been killing things with.
Right. Clearly the shit works. Yeah. I would say, though, that, like, the idea that you're going to find iron sand and build a Viking kiln and refine and carbonize iron into steel and then...
Absolutely not happening.
It's completely ridiculous.
Not by chance.
Requires
sure, if
industry.
Hold on, let me...
Kill the chicken?
Yes. He's gone. Stones! You see that? You see what I used to get rid of them? Stones!
I always preferred unripe mangoes when I was at your place.
Because they're easier to cut.
No, I would just find them on the ground and pelt those fuckers at like 5 a.m.
Yeah, no, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
We're about to get rid of a bunch of them in place of some laying hens, which is going to be great.
Nice.
And another very underutilized part of the Stone Tools game is the ground slate knife. Now, obviously, this is totally not going to last if I'm cutting on a piece of wood with this, right? This is totally not going to last at all. But this one needs resharpening. It sees heavy use at our place. But once this thing gets sharp, for that first 10 cuts, it stays pretty sharp.
What are you cutting with it?
Well, I'm mostly cutting meats and vegetables with it. Right, whatever in the kitchen. I'm using this in the kitchen, and I use it pretty regularly. I like this continuously curved edge.
Why do you prefer it to bone?
It lasts a little bit longer. Honestly, that's really all it is. It lasts a little bit longer.
You ever find slate in your food?
No, I haven't yet, but I'm real careful. You see, I touch this part to the cutting board, and so only this part over here is in contact with the food, while this part touches the cutting board, and it's purposely dulled right where the cutting board is there. And you're just careful. You don't chop with it. You place this part on the cutting board and then slide back and forth as needed. Although usually, just because it's such a long blade, just one quick long pull. I found this piece of slate here, like in the woods, and started on it during a survival trip. I didn't get it to its finished, refined state, but, you know, in the time that I was there, in the manner of, I don't know, what was that, 45 minutes to an hour, like, this thing was field expedient, and I was using it there in the bush. And really all it was refining. It took me longer to flatten out the grinding stone, which I will say, in my experience from making grinding stones, you need to have, if you want a really truly flat edge, you need 3 relatively flat stones that you grind together. Grind these 2, constantly turning. Then grab the 3rd stone and grind that against each of the other 2. And eventually you'll end up with a pretty flat stone. And I've used them to sharpen steel knives before, but it took, I mean, I don't know how many hours I was putting in, but it took a number of days to get my grinding stone to the point where it was flat enough that I didn't catch on one of those little dips or have a high spot, or where, you know, I was using like a rougher sandstone, and so there would be pieces of, you know, larger sand or larger stone embedded in the sandstone.
Yeah.
That would continuously hit the knife blade and dull it in that spot. And, you know, it took a number of hours. I don't know how many hours that was.
You know how a chef steel works? You know, like
roughly.
Yeah, so like you're basically polishing the edge. I've found more luck using like a smooth pebble and like very carefully like working the edge polished and flat than I have found grinding on like gritty rocks in nature. In terms of sharpening a steel edge, that, and like when I know I'm not going to be able to sharpen my edge on my grinding setup, like my nice grindstones, then I try not to dull them and I strop them aggressively. Like almost after every use, if I have a leather belt or a leather strap, I'm like putting it on a flattish surface and stropping the shit out of it and really trying to maintain the edge. And I'll do things like, I'd rather carve a wooden knife and use that for cutting grass than dull my steel knife cutting grass or things like that. Like anything I can get around using my steel edge for so that I can preserve it for like carving important tasks like carving or skinning and gutting.
I mean, for cutting grasses, I've only ever done like flakes out of really hard, rough stone.
Right, that would be another.
Usually, when I'm cutting them is here, and we don't have we have one source for halfway decent stone that gets a really truly sharp edge, right? And so if I'm not in the area where I can get this specific stone, I'm using much rougher stones. I get a really large one.
Yeah.
So that I have a longer edge to work with,
yeah,
and just try to wail on it just in the right position and get a longer piece that I can get, and then use that to cut the grass. I find that actually works way better than a steel edge does anyway, because
right,
it's more of a saw blade.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've had success both with polishing the edge with with like a smooth pebble and making a grinding stone and using that. But like I said, I want to say it was 6 to 8 hours of manufacture time on a stone that was like, if you picked it up, it looked flat, right? To the naked eye, you're like, oh, this is super flat, make a great grinding stone. Then you actually go to use your knife against it, and it's like, oh, that really wasn't truly flat, right? So I started with what you would pick up and say, oh, that's flat. But I knew that time, I was like, I've done this enough to know this is not truly flat. And yeah, 6 to 8 hours of just grinding, picking up another stone, grinding. And I did actually get to where it was functioning like a store-bought grinding stone, but that was a number. That was 6 to 8 hours at least of manufacture time. In fact, the polishing stone, the finished stone, was far longer than that. I had to grind that sucker for a while. It was a really tight-grained, harder stone. I don't even know how long that took. I mean, the first stones for the rough shaping were done within the first 3 days, 6 to 8 hours. The other one was at least 2 weeks in. And what was that, 20 hours? 20 plus hours to get like a sharp enough edge where I could shave with it. And I was protecting the hell out of that knife edge until that point. where I got it to where it was like, all right, this is sharpening. So yeah, I mean that's a huge thing I think that people just don't think about with steel is, yeah, if you're not carrying that diamond sharpener with you all the time, and yes, they can be lightweight, they can be small, but like a little, like field expedient diamond sharpener is not really the easiest thing to sharpen with unless you're really experienced with it. And usually, like, I go to my best sharpening stones. I'm not picking up that tiny little thing when I'm at home. I'm picking up the good one. So when I'm out in the field trying to use this tiny little grinding stone, tiny little sharpening stone, I'm not necessarily going to get the best results right away. Right. Sure, if I practice with it a whole bunch, then sure. And I would say another thing, so my biggest thing with the stone is the learning process, right? You're learning manufacture process in a completely different way, right? Usually with the steel, you're carving, and there's, sure, different holding positions and different ways to carve, but like it's kind of the same process the whole way through. Versus with stone, you have many different holding positions, and like people always think of making a bow drill spindle like this carving motion. Anytime I've used stone tools, I've never made a spindle with a carving motion with these things. Sure, I mean, I could like draw this piece of stone towards me, but I'm using a grinding stone. For definitely. So many more of my manufacture process, and people just don't necessarily think about that.
I think
the whole sand and water on a grinding stone to work down the bow was because I was like, God, I'm sick of this thing not being flat, because I'm chopping at it with this stone axe and carving on it with this little, small flakes. And then I was like, oh wait, grind it down, so it forces you to think of different ways to manufacture what it is that you're making. And I would say it kind of like eliminates the hobbyist a little bit. Well, that's right. It's turning you from like the bushcrafter into the survival person, like
right, or like a stone.
You're going to have more ideas.
Yeah, I think that's the thing too that one of the biggest weak spots that I would say like exists in the flint knapping world is that most people are just obsessed with making pretty case points that they can like sell or use for dick measuring contests, and then and like the number of people I see actually creating stone tools for usage and then making other projects with all stone tools, it's very limited. And so I think like that's something I'd really love to see get expanded in the stone tool world, is people really making an effort to do more with stone than just points, and especially case points. And like there's a whole different methodology if you're gonna saw through a piece of bone or a piece of wood. Even with stone, you basically, if you're cutting deep, you're starting two cuts and then bringing them together. Almost nobody knows that. Or how like I had been using stone tools through multiple different schools for like 10 years before we got to Callahan's, and he showed us the 90-degree edge scrapers. And I was like, how the fuck have I not seen that you can take a 90-degree edge broken piece of rock that's a good material and scrape with it, and it's as useful as a cabinet scraper? Like, and
I would say more.
Right.
I would say more, because you can really put weight behind it.
Right, and that tool...
And that points to what I'm saying, where the hobbyist versus the like the skilled practitioner.
Right.
Right? And I, like, along those same lines, it's like there's... When I was first learning, it was always this push towards, like... People would say, oh, it needs to be as thin as it can to be as sharp as it can. And it really needs to be super sharp, otherwise it's not going to work. Well, in my personal experience, all about penetrating into the animal's side. So I don't care if the thing snaps upon entry, so long as it makes that entry, right? And it all changed when I started, like, I mean, I shot into very many animals with stone tools, and I found that the biggest drawback, I was always told it needs to be as thin as it can for penetration. It's not even the stone point that's the penetration issue on an animal. It's the transition from the stone to the wood.
Right.
And it's like I had to do that how many times before I was like, oh, just carve this part down really thin and make it a nice smooth transition. And it was like 90% of those problems went away. And you can see how, people more towards the late woodland period were able to get away with these super janky looking, very thick arrowheads because the experience made it, the experience they had made them understand where the catch points were. And it's definitely true that generally speaking, like the modern flint knapping world is about making ego measuring tools, right? Like this is the tool that you're using 90% of the time for most projects. It's a freaking flake.
I will say though, I think the shitty arrowheads that we see in the late woodland are war points. I
wouldn't be surprised.
I think that it's just like, oh my god, I need to knock 50 arrowheads out and then like put them on a stick and dip them in dog shit and throw them in a quiver and get ready to fling them at these white bastards. Like, I think that's probably more what happened than like, because if you look at the refined knapping that was still coming out during that time period, there's still really like incredible knappers. And then maybe also like when stone starts to get steel starts to get introduced and trade points start to show up, then you might have seen like a degradation of knapping skills because people were only doing it when they had to and it wasn't like the life way, the only way. But yeah, man, I think a lot of that was war. But I get what you're saying.
If you had a nice refined point, you'd be stone point. Especially if you didn't sit on a mountain of obsidian, you'd be holding on to that thing, resharpening it as carefully as you could, sending it back to the expert every single time, and it will go in your best hunting quiver. Like you're saying, it doesn't. If I'm shooting somebody for war, I just need to hit them hard enough to hurt them really bad,
right?
And slow them down.
Hopefully, give them an infection, and like move on with your day. Yeah, because you're just flinging.
Slow them down enough to club them in the head.
Right. Yeah, in general, like I think the ultimate answer, like you said before, is to know how to use both. I think it is like a bit of a shame. Some people don't even make it past the point of like knowing what a good steel knife looks like. And I think that like as far as if your concern is actually I need to just survive and I don't care about learning this for like the more romantic, it's cause it's cool, then I think steel wins hands down. I think that if you're looking to get into like a really cool adventure in terms of like a long-term education, that you could really pick either, because blacksmithing's pretty dope also, like there's the idea that you can make the tools to make the tools to make the tools is something that's always gotten me super stoked. So like making tongs so that you can make a hammer so that you can make a steel, any steel tool you want, like that shit's pretty boss. So I think the progression, like for my students, usually they get into survival through some like ridiculous notion that by taking a weekend class they're gonna then like be able to survive nature, and then hopefully they have a good time because working on the skills is fulfilling, and they get bit hard enough by the bug to start following all the little alleyways, and when you get to the alleyway of stone tools you realize it leads you to a whole fucking empire of cool shit, and that like you can get obsessed with stone tool making in its own right, and then using the stone tools and then being like, wait, can I push the edges of our culture relearning this way of producing and using tools? Like that shit's really cool to me, and that's where I hope more people go. But if like I have to just tell people what to put in their backpack so that they're less likely to die, then a steel knife and probably like a silky saw and maybe a hatchet are on that list, and a steel canteen is certainly on that list, and some steel fishing hooks are on that list, and some steel braided picture wire to use for snares is on that list, and like there's a lot of really useful things. Oh
well, definitely. I mean, there's no question that Yeah, I mean, for just purely, you have to survive till tomorrow. I mean, all arguments of romance are completely out the window. However, I will say that, like, you know, people's knowledge of their steel tools is not quite up to par with what they might need, you know, in a real life circumstance. Like, I mean, I love the silky saw. I use it all the time. I mean, have you ever tried to sharpen a modern saw?
Yeah, that's not happening.
You see what I mean? Like, like if you dull it, you're not sharpening that thing. And that's another thing too. Like, I mean, I've seen people with some cool modern knives that have some, you know, some very, very durable steel. Like, really hard modern steels need really hard modern tools
to
resharpen them.
Yeah.
Right? Or to adjust them. Your handle breaks and you got to make a new handle, and this hole doesn't fit the size of the piece that you're trying to stick in there, and now you got to, like, drill a new hole. Right? You're not drilling a new hole through that piece of steel with anything within the space of a month. Right? And I find that a lot of times people are, like, kind of going overboard with some of the modern steels as far as, like, for a survival purpose. I mean, like, the higher quality carbon steel, like, yes, it's harder to maintain, right? It's, you know, it's a little bit more persnickety than a pretty sweet stainless steel, but, like, it's the most workable. And I think that, you know, it kind of fits into the same sort of category as what we're talking about with, like, modern flint knapping. There's this idea of what is the best versus how do I know what kind of situation I'm going to get into and what kind of shit I'm going to have to deal with, right? And you're talking about preserving your edge, right? And that's why I kind of started this off with, like, it's better to know how to make one of these flakes efficiently. So it's like, shit, I don't want to dull my steel tool on these grasses to make myself a bed. What are going to be my options if I don't know how to make one of these flakes? I'm going to tear my hands up ripping the grasses out of the ground.
Right.
You know, hoping I find, like, a deer jaw so that I can saw with the deer jawbone. You know, maybe I find a piece of slate that's good enough that I can make a blade, you know, just using that kind of grinding, you know, technology. I really think, as for a survivalist standpoint, it makes sense to know both. Because how am I going to preserve that tool without the knowledge of the stone tools? I'm not likely to be able to preserve that knife edge, right? So I really think that you know, they go hand in hand.
Right. Or what if you lose your knife? Or what if you didn't have a knife? Like, you know,
it breaks. What if it breaks?
Right. Plane crash scenario. You know, TSA didn't let you carry your knife. Now what? Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, yeah, so I
think
think
that happens most of the time when people get in survival situations. It's like, it's a whoops, right? That's why they're there in the first place.
Right.
So, you know, you kind of have to know both.
Right. Well, yeah.
But I agree. If I found a hunk of metal, if I'm in a survival situation and maybe I have some stones and I'm breaking them and making the best tools I can, but if I have a hunk of metal, you better believe I'm grinding that thing down.
Right.
Right.
Or, dude, so
guaranteed.
We just had a group go out. Our, like, 9-month survival class just went out and did their 4-day survival trip, just the clothes on their back, 4 days and nights. And I went up to track their area after they were there, and there was some hilarious shit, like, you know, a yellow birch branch that they had tried to break, and it was green, and it's just, like, all twisted. And you can see some poor bastard, like, twisted this thing like 50 times trying to get it to break, and it's just like all wood fibers, which is an amazing testament to, like, the usefulness of a whiffy, you know, of, like, using just that as a quickie cord for lashing and shit like that. But, like, it was hilarious to me, whereas, like, if you just had a knife, it would just be, all right, now this thing is mine, I'm gonna walk away. So
well, or if you started your flint knapping journey thinking that this is what you had to make,
right,
versus actually spending the time and knowing how to use this, which anybody could do with very little amount of, like, learning time. You just got to keep hitting it until you get one of these,
right,
and then you could use that,
and
right?
and good material.
Well, definitely good material helps. Yeah. You know.
Well, I mean, that's the thing too. Is, like, where are you?
Suggest to people is the worse the material is, the bigger I try to work.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if it's bad material, I see people like, oh, well, you know, try to make this little flake because they think it's smaller, that it's easier. But, like, no, if it's worse material, the biggest flake you could take.
That's why block on block is the shit.
One.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely.
Block
and again,
on block
under
is where it's
practiced,
at.
because everybody's trying to make this pretty little thing to measure their ego by, right? Versus, like, what am I going to do? I need something sharp like this, right? I'm going to take a big, huge hunk of stone, and I'm going to whack it against another huge hunk of stone to get this big, rugged piece of stone to use to carve on, right? And it's that, like, it's... I know, right? You hearing my kid in the background? You gotta love it.
I'm dying!
Does this all go into the podcast?
Yeah.
Does this all go into it? Oh, look.
I mean, it's real.
There she is.
Real life.
It all goes in.
Yeah.
Where were we? Now that I've lost my place completely.
I mean, I think we've come around to the same place, which is like, clearly steel in the moment is better and can do things that stone can't. Clearly stone is cooler and has a very obvious survival usefulness in that if it's available on the landscape and you know how to nap it, then that's going to be a more realistic go-to in a survival situation where you don't have a steel knife. And then, you know, outside of that, it's kind of like pick your poison of what do you want to study. And like, as much as I'll shit talk the bushcraft community for their man forts and their like endless obsession with knives and axes, like I own way too many steel knives and axes, more than I could ever use in my life. If you look in my pack right now, there's like 4 different, like I carry clippers, I carry a silky saw, I carry a Leatherman that has multiple knives in it, I carry a little tiny super sharp carving knife, and then I carry my like beat around knife that's like just a good carbon steel full tang knife, and then I always have one of these, you know. So, and if it's winter, I probably have a hatchet or an axe with me. So like, there's that level of the spectrum, and that makes sense to me. But in terms of like when I have free time, I'm going to the pit and flint napping so that I can make cool shit out of rocks. Like,
you know, part of the reason why I'm willing to make this argument is because I don't like carrying stuff. Like, I really don't. You know, like, I try to carry as little as I possibly can. It's part of the reason why I'm probably chronically dehydrated during most days. I don't even feel like carrying water. Like, I just don't want to carry stuff. Right? I'm not into it, right? So I usually just carry one blade that's, like, big enough to be batonable, but small enough to, like, reasonably carve with. And I'm like, oh man, I gotta chop this thing. Well, shit, let me grab a stone real quick and just, like, at least get the first few chops out of the way. Like, see if I can hack this thing down. Part of that was, like, through the learning process. I would say that when I first started using stone tools that I was increasing manufacturing time by, like, 3 times the amount of time. And then after, I don't know how many hours, but, you know, after a number of hours of dirt time, I shrunk that down to about 1/3 to 1/2 the time again for most projects that I reasonably take on. Right? Something more complicated like a bow, yes, I'm going to still double to triple the amount of manufacture time. But for simple stuff like a spindle, you know, that first time it took me easily 3 times the amount of time.
Oh, yeah.
But at this point, it's really only adding like a third of the time again.
Right.
So if it takes me 10 minutes to make that, I'm only spending like 12 to 15 minutes the most manufacturing that with stones.
Totally.
But yeah, the more complicated projects, yeah, it'll take me longer. And, you know, that only came about from actually using it. And I found out very quickly I almost never use these. Like, it's like, this is for butchering meat. Right? This is for cutting meat in the kitchen.
Right.
I mean, they're beautiful.
Like refined work
I can
on like an advanced tool.
Totally. Yeah. Totally. Like a few little carvings here and there, but I'm not using that. And of course, it was like I had to fight through that learning curve of I learned from people who fantastic flint nappers, but if you're not spending time carving with those stone tools, you're not going to know what is going to work the best. If you're not actually shooting animals with those arrowheads, you're not going to know what it needs to look like.
Right.
And that's really, you know, one of one of my main reasons for advocating for using the stone tool is like it eliminates the hobbyist thing. If you're into being a hobbyist, that's great, but if you want to like know how to survive if you didn't have a piece of steel, you got to use it all the time. You can't just be like, oh, I know how to make a cool arrowhead and call that good enough, right? Like knowing the difference between these two flakes right here, right? They look very similar, but just knowing the difference between them, right? That I'm not going to use this to carve on wood almost ever, but this one I'm going to because it's a little bit thicker, right? And knowing what is that angle that's optimum, right? Like I'm going to use this part over here for cutting the animal up, but I'm going to use this part over here where it's thicker for carving on the wood.
Right, and how to
and
not
just
cut
knowing
your
that
fingers
this,
while you're using it.
Yeah, well, there's that too.
Right.
That's another skill,
yeah.
You know? But again, yeah, just using it, right? It's like just using it, you're going to learn way more. And then I found that like then it affects my tool usage with steel tools as well. Like, oh, hey, I remember that time I used this grinding thing for this, and maybe I'm going to use, like, a rasp for this part instead of using a knife. Or even, like, I've gone kind of the other way of things that I've been using the rasp for so long. I'm like, why don't I just carve it with a knife? What did I do when I was making that Stone Tools bow? Oh, I carved this down, even though I wouldn't have been carving this late in the game with steel tools because trying to do it the way it's supposed to be done is like, oh no, I'm going to carve on this right now because it's going to take too long with this scraper. And then that translated back to my modern tool to like, well, I know how thin it should be, so I can just use my steel knife or my knife to carve this instead of rasping, 200 rasp, strokes versus like, 30 or 40 carving strokes. Like it helped me learn about how to be more efficient in my steel tool usage. Right. From using the stone tools. I never would have gone there. I never would have learned those lessons if I didn't make it harder for myself. Yeah, that's all I got. That's it. We need to stop this argument before I say something else dumb.
Yeah, I mean, I could... Yeah. Anyway, so what do you... I could say a lot of dumb things. So what's going on in St. Croix, man? What's been up?
Well, right now is our down season, so we've been,
fearing hurricanes.
Chicken bins. Hey, can you guys quiet down up there? I was talking to the chickens. Just doing work around on the land, but I've been otherwise working on this bow. I'm trying to have a new bow for a hunting class that's coming up in a couple months. So I went with this piece of Osage that I got from a friend of mine. And I've been doing a lot of these, what they call hollow limb. I don't know if you're going to see this or not. But it's not rectangular. It's got this hollow limb where I've carved out, trying to get it on camera, where I've carved out and made the limbs on the belly side arc to match the arc on the back of the bow.
Why would you do that to yourself?
Because I'm a glutton for punishment.
That's so much work.
It is more work, but I end up getting, just from, it really stemmed from using the bunchberry here that we have, where there's a lot of ridges in the back of the bow. And so you're carving it down, and to keep there from being a thin spot this way, see if I have this arc on the back of the bow that gives me a hard slant.
Yep.
Then if I'm scraping on the belly of the bow and I to where I don't have a wall right on the side, then it cuts into the side and all of a sudden I'm making it thinner side to side because it's not a flat back. And then I extended that to this Osage bow because I was being dumb and felt like doing that to myself. But, I've been getting pretty good at it. And, yeah, it was basically from working with a higher crowned piece of wood. I have heard that having the hollow limb helps improve the compression capabilities of the piece of wood. The issue I run into is, like, trying to keep the edges a certain width so that I don't, so basically I make it even, and you really have to like chase that hollow limb down to the very corner right here Otherwise, it causes compression problems. Does that make sense? You gotta really match the arc of the back of the bow to the belly of the bow. Because if it's uneven in there, you give yourself compression problems. However, this thing is pretty fast shooter, and I'm really stoked on the cordage handle. I'm into it, right? So, yeah, I've been working on this. I got this hunting class coming up in December, so I'm trying to be as prepared as possible. I finished this Osage bow. I've been working on some arrow shafts and getting in the napping pit and making some arrowheads so that I'm as fully prepared as possible, and hoping that the students come with their A game, and A game being archery game on. But yeah, if people aren't confident with the archery, we're gonna make some bolas for catching goats by throwing some ropes and rocks at their legs, snagging up their legs, so I don't have to chase them down.
Oh man, I can't decide if I want to be there with a camera or with a bow.
Should be there with a camera. So we were doing this survival trip, and we were like 5 minutes late every time because people were like, I want to go hunting too. And I was like, all right, but make sure you're there on time. And every time, it was like the first 2 people were 5 minutes late. Then those people were on time the next time, but the next 2 people were 5 minutes late. And we were literally coming up just behind these, just trying to quiet my kids down, just behind these goats. And then it was like, we got there just on time, but instead of, people are chasing down these goats. And I told people, once we start chasing, put the bows away. We're running. I chased this goat down. It was going up the hillside. I chased it back down, and it went right towards his student. And instead of chasing it, he pulled his bow out. And everybody else who was running with him just stopped cold because they want to get shot in the back, which one person almost did. And he shot and missed, but that was the opportunity to catch them. Anyway, he missed. They got a head start, and I'm just trucking. And I'm catching up on these goats, and I sort of half lost my balance. There were 2 guys up here on the rocks watching the whole thing. And let me tell you, that was a pretty hardcore scorpion. I ate it, but it was in total slow-mo. Oh no, I've got it. I can recover from this. Oh no, I didn't recover from this. And my first thought was get the arrow away from you. So I put my hands out and not put them down on purpose because I didn't want to catch the arrow and stab myself. And I ate it so hard. And then jumped back up and ran after him again and almost had them. And then the next class somebody made some bolas. And I was like, oh my god, that's the thing to have. Because if I could have just thrown those bolas at those goats' legs, I would have saved that scorpion. But
nice.
Anyway, that's the plan. Should be pretty fun.
Well, I'd love to film you guys chasing some goats with bolas. Yeah, man, that's dope. Can't wait to get down.
How about
there.
yourself? What you got going on in Vermonty world?
I just finished another arrow. This one here is some Naveculite that I've had around for a minute that I finally hafted onto some viburnum. I'm getting ready to hunt. My deer season starts on Tuesday. And I'll have a couple weeks in the woods before my hunting class goes out and dirties up my forest with their stinky, stinky selves. So, between having the 1-year-old and the 4-year-old, it's going to be tricky trying to get out, but I'll do what I can. I'll have more time this year than I've had in a while, so it'll be good to just get some time alone in the woods. Other than that, man, just been go all summer. We just, we had the rendezvous, it was like a month ago, and just kids programs starting up and finishing out our fall programs, end of the survival classes season, and yeah.
My understanding of the way with the amount of wild areas around you is that it's a much lower density for the deer. How many hours do you think you spend in the saddle there for every 5 minutes of deer sighting?
Oh god, it's fucking brutal, dude. It's pretty bad. We'll see. I've been on top of the plots these last few years, so the deer carrying capacity on the land is a lot higher, and I'll get super excited from what I'm seeing in the tracks. And then when I hang cameras and I look at it, I'm like, oh, that's still like a 3-day pattern. You know, like they're kind of on 2 to 3 day patterns. There's some spots that are real close to bedding areas that are daytime bedding areas that are going to be hard to get in on, that there'll be a lot of movement. But right now, largely what I'm seeing is like does with yearlings, which I would shoot a doe. Does taste really good. The problem is that like the does really keep the yearlings alive through the winter, their first winter. And it sucks shooting them and then being like, all right, little yearling, survive a Vermont winter by yourself. And like if they end up coyote food, then that's good for the coyotes. But there's this pair of does who hang out together with their yearlings, and I'm like, if I shot one of you, the other one would be fine because it would just post up and stay with you guys. So I'm kind of targeting one of those moms, and then if I get, we have more does on the land now, so that should be bringing in more bucks. And so I've seen some sign of bucks. I honestly think a lot about shooting a bear. There's a fuck ton of bear around here.
This is one of the joys of deer hunting here is that like I'm never worried about that because it's a non-native species, so I'm not like concerned with their numbers, and they really have no problem reproducing. There's plenty of deer here, but that whole like how many hours do I want to spend waiting versus watching the animals is kind of a big reason why I switched to the goats more heavily. Also, they're so easy to pattern comparatively.
Right.
It's like they're gonna be on this beach at 3:30, and it's like you get there at 3:20, and literally 10 minutes later they're there. And I've gotten to know them where it's like, ooh, they went this way, so we should just go around the rocks, and they're gonna be there in 10 minutes, and they'll be there in 10 minutes. It's freaking magic. And also they damage the landscape so much more than the deer do. Like they just tear the landscape up. So I can feel good about that when I shoot one.
Yeah.
So.
No, I'm gonna come with tackle. I'll come with some broadheads.
Oh yeah. Do it.
Yeah. You got that bow of mine still there, right?
Oh yeah.
Good.
Oh yeah. Haven't loaned it out too much. I was scraping on it with some stone tools, but luckily the stone tools took so long. I scraped on it for a while, but didn't make a dent.
Oh man. Yeah, man. And then this weekend that stave guy shows up, so hopefully he's got a good batch of staves. I'll send some your way.
Awesome.
Yeah, man. Just doing it all. And then other than that, just like cool to watch my kid get better at carving, and she's been napping and she's been weaving, and yeah. All those.
Oh yeah, man, I love watching my kids do the archery. Man, my son is getting really good with his bow. It's like super impressive, honestly, how easy it is. Like, and I've just showed him how to pull it back. I've never once talked to him about aiming, and it's really amazing to watch the instinctive archery, teach itself.
Right.
Right? Like I didn't say, no, do this or do that or do the other thing. I just handed him the bow and handed him the arrow, and it's just like seeing him do what I hear people describing in a class. Like, oh, this is how you do it? This is exactly how he does it. It's pretty amazing to watch that come about.
Nice.
So I think I won the argument, so maybe we should just call this a podcast. Woo!
Yeah, when I get there, we could have a fight where you get a stone tool and I get a metal one.
That's okay. I'm gonna put mine on the end of a really long stick.
Or a short stick with a bent one with a string.
I'm gonna throw it at you at the right time.
All right, man. Well, good one. And
yep.
Yeah, we'll decide what we're gonna argue about next.
Yep. If you actually took the time to listen to and watch this here podcast, you can send us some ideas for what you want to hear us argue and banter on about. Otherwise, yeah, we're just gonna keep going at it, and we'll see you next time with the next one.
Peace out.
Adios.